Is it 14 or 15? Oh, the 15th day. Okay, I got it. Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we are in class number 15, and yesterday we kind of went in details and off track, I know, with the subject and kind of went off track, but inshallah we'll stick to what we were talking about in terms of tafsir, inshallah. We left off at this ayah still. قل أي شيء أكبر شهادة قل الله شهيد بيني وبينكم وأوحي إلي هذا القرآن لأنذركم به ومن بلغ أئنكم لتشهدون أن مع الله آلهة أخرى قل لا أشهد قل إنما هو إله واحد وإنني بريء مما تشركون. And we also did this ayah as well. الذين آتيناهم الكتاب يعرفونه كما يعرفون أبناءهم الذين خسروا أنفسهم فهم لا يؤمنون. And we were at Tafseer Al-Qurtubi, and we said, we commented on the part, let's see, basically the whole ayah, really. قُلْ أَيُّ شَيْءٍ أَكْبَرُ شَهَادَةٍ. We talked about the witness, and we talked about it as an evidence, that is the Quran. وَأُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ, that the Quran was revealed basically as the witness, as itself the witness, the evidence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the message, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the warning. Why? Because he said, لِأُنذِرَكُمْ بِهِ. So the main reason for the Quran was really to bring a warning, a reminder, basically to inform people that their life had a meaning, that their life was for a purpose, that their life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it, that it was not for, basically for no reason, for no purpose, or just plain matter in motion, but it was actually created for a purpose that preceded the creation of matter, that preceded the creation of human beings, that preceded the creation of everything that basically is given the energy to function. Okay, لِأُنذِرَكُمْ بِهِ, to bring you a warning, وَمَنْ بَلَغْ. So whether it is to warn and to bring a warning for the people that received the message, that is the people that were present during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, or whether it is وَمَنْ بَلَغْ, or whether it is the people that had received the message, that is received the Quran, received the information that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the Prophet. So وَمَنْ بَلَغْ, whether it is one, whoever reached the age of puberty, or two, whoever basically received the message. So it's within both. أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَشْهَدُونَ مَعَ اللَّهِ آلِهَةً أُخْرَى. Are you witnessing, or of course, the reason why that is they were receiving this message is because they were off Tawheed. They were off the belief of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قُلْ لَا أَشْهَدُ. So here it is, the main announcement. Say, I do not witness, I do not believe that there's another Lord, or Lord, or a deity other than the Lord Almighty to be worshipped. قُلْ إِنَّمَا هُوَ إِلَهُ وَاحِدٌ. And say He's only one Lord Almighty. وَإِنَّنِي بَرِيءٌ مِّمَّا تُشْرِكُونَ. And I am free, I am innocent of worshiping, of what you're worshiping. الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. The ones that had received the book, meaning the people of the book, the scriptures that had come before, they would know about the prophecies, know about the Prophet ﷺ, know about the message that was sent before even it being present to them, because they would know about the prophecy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had foretold them about Islam and foretold them about the Prophet sallallahu الذين خسروا أنفسهم. Therefore, since they had received the message, since they basically, وَمَنْ بَلَغ, and the people had reached and seen and witnessed the message being delivered, then in the end, الَّذِينَ خَسِرُوا أَنفُسَهُم, the ones to be in total loss are the ones to abstain from belief, are the ones to basically avoid belief in itself and stay away from belief. And we talked about إنكم لتشهدون أن مع الله آلهة أخرى. We talked about الذين آتيناهم الكتاب. We said آتيناهم الكتاب, meaning the Christians and the Jews. But can the الذين آتيناهم الكتاب also be the Muslims themselves, even a Muslim be الذين آتيناهم الكتاب يعرفونه كما يعرفون أبنائهم? Can that also mean that if we're speaking about the Muslims themselves, that if they are really believers, that they would invest in knowing their children, in knowing the Quran as they would know their children, not knowing their children, but they would know the Quran as they would know their own children. Is that also meaning that? Can we get the inspiration in that as well? That the way that you should know the Quran is, for example, since this is talking about يعرفونه, meaning that know the Quran itself as the nearest, since this is a pronoun, to basically refer to the Quran itself as the nearest noun that was mentioned. Does that mean that this would give us the inference that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that a true Muslim would be a person that would recognize the Quran, learn the Quran, the way that they would recognize, learn, the way that they would observe their children closely, etc. So we can get that inspiration, even though that's not what the context is actually saying. But we can get the inspiration that a true believer, that a true Muslim would take the time and invest the time to observe the Quran, to study the scripture, basically, the scripture that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed, and that they would invest the time to learn, they would invest the time to memorize, they would invest the time to repeat, they would invest the time to engage with the Quran in order to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the message. So we can get the inspiration of that, but that's not what the text is actually saying. Okay, now let's continue. وَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ مِمَّنِ افْتَرَى عَلَى اللَّهِ كَذِبًا أَوْ كَذَّبَ بِآيَاتِهِ إِنَّهُ لَا يُفْلِحُ الظَّالِمُونَ وَيَوْمَ نَحْشُرُهُمْ جَمِيعًا ثُمَّ نَقُولُ الَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا أَيْنَ شُرَكَاؤُكُمُ الَّذِينَ كُنْتُمْ تَزْعُمُونَ. So now we're actually going into something rather really hard and really scary to read. So after it was talking about that the true people in loss, that the ones to be in loss are the ones that objected, are the ones that had lost themselves, are the ones that did not embrace the opportunity of faith. And then eventually they had lost themselves and lost the opportunity and did not make use of the opportunity. What opportunity? Opportunity number one is basically life that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. Opportunity two is hidayah and guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent to you. Opportunity number three is that you had basically reached the age of maturity and you basically were given the capacity to comprehend, to understand, to hear, to listen, to basically use the potentials to direct you to getting and being part of those that will get to Jannah. So then the ayah says, وَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ. This isn't a question, this isn't an interrogative clause, but it's saying وَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ مِمَّنِ افْتَرَى عَلَى اللَّهِ كَذِبًا أَوْ كَذَّبَ بِآيَاتِهِ. Now, as you know, what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a general translation first, and then we're going to get deeper and deeper and zoom in closer and closer till we get to the better understanding. وَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ ومن أظلم ممن افترى على الله كذبا أو كذب بآيته. That there's no one that is considered as more unjust or more, well, it's supposed to be unjust. What is it supposed to be? Let's say there's no worse oppressor than a person that had created blasphemy and made up lies about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or denied the verses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent. إنه لا يفلح الظالمون. For the ones that are oppressors, they would not be in any success. And on Judgment Day, they would be resurrected all, or they would all be resurrected. And then they would be told, basically, for those specifically that had associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where are the things that you had associated partners with? Those that you had claimed to be God, yet there was nothing worse in the trial, but then they would say, Wallahi Rabbina, by Allah, we were not associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. انظر كيف كذبوا على أنفسهم. See and just observe and just watch how they had basically lied about themselves. And وَضَلَّ عَنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا يَفْتَرُونَ. And all the things that they had worshipped, all the things that they had embraced, basically turned away from them. And all that they had claimed in blasphemy was basically turned away. And some would hear you. Some, oh, just give me a second. So وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَسْتَمِعُ إِلَيْكَ, and some would hear you, and yet وَجَعَلْنَا عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ أَكِنَّةً, yet what was actually put on their hearts is an akinna. An akinna, is it something to obstruct them? Is it something that they had no control over that was obstructing their ability to understand? That's what we'll talk about down the road, inshallah. وَفِي آذَانِهِمْ وَقْرًا, and in their ears there's also something to obstruct their ability to hear it. And every time they would say a miracle, they would not believe in it until they would come to you and they would argue, and then within the argument they would basically claim and say and give you the accusation, the disbelievers that is, that this is nothing but أساطير الأولين, that this is nothing but mere historical and past legends of the past, and therefore they would basically claim that they would not believe in it because they know that this is nothing but mere legends. وَهُمْ يَنْهَوْنَ عَنْهُ وَيَنْأَوْنَ عَنْهُ. Then they would deter away from it, and they would deter others away from it. وَإِيُهْلِكُونَ إِلَّا أَنفُسَهُمْ وَمَا يَشْعُرُونَ. And they would only destruct themselves, but they don't even recognize and they don't even realize that they're actually destructing their own opportunities, destructing their own selves. And if you were to watch them as they would be right there standing before the hellfire, and they would say, we wished we would give the chance to return, and we would not deny the verses of the Lord Almighty, and we would be amongst the believers. But then, بل بدا لهم ما كانوا يخفون من قبل. Everything that they had denied and they had hid before, it would come to them right there in their observation, in something that they could witness. This is talking about Judgment Day. They had denied that Judgment Day would ever happen, and now it basically appears, and it right before their eyes, it becomes something that they could never deny. And even if they were to be returned to basically life, they would go back to what they were doing, but they were just the ones to always be in disbelief, in lies, and live in denial, in continuous denial. And then they said, what is the denial that they were living in? What is that they had basically thought this life was all about? And they said, this is just our life. This is just, in other words, matter in motion. This is just our life, and this is the life, and there's nothing after it. There is nothing that is going to be after this life, and that this is basically mere legends, and they denied in any form of shape that they were going to be resurrected. But then, if you were only to see them, when they would be standing right before their Lord would say, is this not the truth? And they would say, verily it is by the Lord, by our Lord. In other words, now they're making an oath by their Lord Almighty. So the Lord will say, then you will taste the torments for what you had basically denied, and what you had denied and what you had rejected. And those that had denied their Lord Almighty and denied meeting their Lord Almighty, this is basically the major loss. Until the day that the hour would come suddenly, and they would say, Ya hasratana. They would say that they would recognize, woe unto us for all that loss that we had lost, and they would carry all their sins on their backs. Verily, this is the worst loss, and all the sins that they had committed and the denial that they had committed is right now nothing but a burden over their backs. For what life is all about, they had lived it, nothing but la'ib and lahu, nothing but playing and entertainment. Yet the hereafter is better for the ones that had taken the religious integrity and taqwa seriously. Do you not see? Do you not comprehend to see the pattern? قد نعلم إنه ليحزنك الذي يقولون. We know, O Muhammad, we know, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, O Muhammad, we know that you're saddened by what their claims, by the claims that they would bring, and by what they had put forth in order to deny. For they're not just denying you, but the ones that are disbelievers, the ones that are oppressors, are always basically denying the words of the Lord Almighty. And previously, the previous prophets were also denied, were also rejected, but they were patient on what they were denied in. And they were harmed until they had received the victory. And there's no change to the word, to the decree, to the message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent. وَلَقَدْ جَاءَكَ مِن نَبَإِ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. And you had received some of the stories of the different prophets that had come before you. And if you would find that their rejection was something that was too heavy and too painful for you to see, even if you basically had a tunnel built underground, or you had a ladder to be connected with the skies, and you had brought them every single miracle before their eyes, and even if that you would do, they would still be in denial. And if the Lord had wanted that everyone would be a believer and would be on the path of faith and the path of guidance, then the Lord Almighty would have been capable of making that happen. فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. Do not be amongst those that would be al-jahilin, whether it's the prehistoric era, or whether it's the time of Jahiliyyah, or whether it's lacking knowledge about the data and lacking knowledge about the pattern that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created. We'll talk about that. The ones, إِنَّمَا يَسْتَجِيبُ الَّذِينَ يَسْمَعُونَ وَالْمَوْتَى يَبْعَثُهُمُ اللَّهُ ثُمَّ إِلَيْهِ يُرْجَعُونَ. The ones that are going to be responding and taking the call, that is the message that you are coming with. The only ones that will embrace it are the ones that are going to be hearing it. The ones that are going to be hearing it, whether it's hearing it with their hearts or hearing it with their ears, or whether hearing it with their minds. In other words, they're taking the words in close observation. Yet, وَالْمَوْتَى يَبْعَثُهُمُ اللَّهُ ثُمَّ إِلَيْهِ يُرْجَعُونَ. One thing that there's no doubt of, a fact that the Lord Almighty would resurrect the dead, and then they would come back to the Lord Almighty. Now, we're going to be doing, hopefully, up until 36 in today's tafsir, inshallah. You could see it's pretty scary because it's actually laying out a couple things here. It's laying out how the disbelievers are basically in denial. But one thing that we would say, that even if they were to come back, they would still be in denial. Does that mean that some people are just created to be born to disbelieve, and others were created to born to believe? We'll talk about that. But if that is true, then are we actually controlled and not given free will? So we'll talk about that, inshallah, and we'll answer that. Maybe not today, but maybe perhaps tomorrow. So let's see. Let's start with the first one. وَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ مِمَّنِ افْتَرَى عَلَى اللَّهِ كَذِبًا. When you see وَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ, this isn't an interrogative clause, but this is actually bringing you this form. In other words, in this sentence, it's basically giving us the information. But the question is, what is a dhulm? A dhulm is exceeding the limit. The word ظَلَمَ basically means to exceed the limit. What limit is it necessarily exceeding? So there is a limit that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had created. In other words, the truth, the facts, the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically informed you of. But just by denying the truth, then in that situation, you are exceeding the limit. The implication is going to be that you would be exceeding the limit in how you would use those potentials, where you would use them in, and certainly how you and what you would make of your own life. Because that's the first and most important potential. Let's see, what are the most important potentials that Islam regards as the most important things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you? It's really the D-N-A-I-M again. Let's look at that. The what? Again? Can you say that again? Sure. Let's remind for those that basically are not used to taking those classes. Let's see what D-N-A-I-M means. So there are certain legal maxims, there are certain things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us. They're basically considered as the most sacred, or considered as having the highest sanctity. And certainly they're the most important things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you in life. And if anybody would transgress the limit and not put in channel these opportunities in the right way, then in that situation, They would basically be in an imbalance or committing injustice, or they would be, in another term, and an easier term, they would be oppressors. Let's just see what those are in order. Number one is D for deen. In other words, it's referring to guidance, it's referring to faith, it's referring to basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent. Number two, nafs, your life and other people's lives, is basically that other precious and sacred thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us. Therefore, we would basically regard it as the second sanctuary thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us. And number three, the A is aql, your own mind. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid contaminating the mind, toxicating the mind, or even intoxicating the mind, whether we're speaking about substances or whether we're speaking about information. Basically, if it's toxic, if we're talking about toxic information, if we're talking about using different methods to probably pacify your mind from seeing the path, from understanding the path, from comprehending the path, from practicing the path, that would basically be contaminating the mind. Number four, and that is the I, the ird, the chastity, making family, reproduction. So that would basically be that other opportunity, that other gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you, making family, reproduction, basically helping you recognize stages in your life, helping you move on to reproduce, basically helping you to make family. All of that is basically important. And finally, we're talking about property. So whether we're talking about for mal, wealth, property, and certainly all the different things that you would have around you, whether we're speaking about an actual wealth. Well, in this legal maxim, when we would speak about mal, we're actually talking about an actual wealth, whether we're speaking about cash or whether we're speaking about goods or whether we're speaking about just different property that is part of your ownership. So that would be al-mal. Or whether we're speaking about other valuable things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you, meaning other potentials. Even though the word mal doesn't refer to that, but at least we recognize that some of the potentials that are considered as you're lucky to get them is basically a rizq. Rizq can be specific to meaning wealth and property, and rizq can be more comprehensive to include the different potentials that you were given, maybe intelligence, maybe social status. All those areas are basically considered as potentials that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. Okay, so when you look at al-dhulm, what is al-dhulm? Al-dhulm would basically mean if the person had exceeded the limit. What limit are we talking about? Basically exceeded the limit in deen. They did not believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or they did believe in Allah, but they didn't put it into practice. That's dhulm. Or nafs. They basically had this life, but then they didn't use the life for in the direction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically instructed us to use it in. Aql, mind, that this person had the mind, this person had the education, but their education basically was directing them towards the wrong conclusion. They basically were indoctrinated with the wrong information. It ended up basically going off the track of faith. Ird, they used their chastity, they used their reproduction, they used their drives basically in the wrong way, not in the way to channel it towards akhirah, and certainly not in the right way to channel it towards what is good for them. And basically mal, the same thing. So when you look at al-dhulm here is really emphasized not necessarily on the comprehensive definition of dhulm within the DNAIM, but this is actually more specific in telling us that what the worst dhulm, although exceeding the limit in probably not using your life right, your mental health, and all the different things that we had said, is definitely a form of injustice. But the highest level of injustice anyone can commit is basically the injustice in considering or interpreting the relationship between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why would that even be the worst thing? Why can't we consider that if a person is living as a good citizen on earth, and this person is, hey, donating to the people of Africa, they're building schools, hospitals, and all of that, and why can't we consider that, look, this person has been a good citizen, and yes, they're probably atheists, but they're contributing in good ways to the different people all over the world. Why do we still consider that these people are basically, in this context of this ayah, that they're actually oppressors, that they're actually going to go to hell? Why have them get to hell when they had contributed for the people of Africa? They had done so much good. Why would they still be considered that they had basically oppressed themselves? So that's what we're going to be talking about, inshallah, in this detail within this ayah. Number one, to answer this question, when we speak of creation, what comes before creation? It's basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the one that had the right to determine what creation was for. That's number one. Number two, the different potentials that you were given, whether it's the money that you had donated, or whether it's, let's say I don't know, you were a singer, and the singer basically made billions of dollars or whatever it is, and now they're using the money basically to donate, and probably, yeah, also clubbing and all of that, but basically that was one of the things that they were using it for. Okay, who gave you these potentials? Who gave you the beautiful voice? Who gave you perhaps the attraction? Who gave you all of that? It's basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then we would say, in order for you to basically be considered as someone that is good, who defines good? Who defines good? It's basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you the potential and told you to use it on certain terms of good, not your terms of what makes good. Certainly, you did overlap and you did do it in certain areas and actually do what is good. Some of it is based on the terms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you were myopic in putting in the complete picture and saying where good is supposed to be at in making the income and basically investing it in the right place. Because if a person, let's say a singer, if a person is making this income in a way that is going against bringing prosperity, bringing health, bringing mental health, bringing chastity, bringing guidance to people, and at the same time feeding others, then in that situation, the destruction, the misguidance that you had basically done is going to, think of it as math. It's basically going to come in, and this will cancel out the good that you had done. But is it still good? I mean, we're not going to deny that it's still good that Angelina Jolie, for example, donated millions of dollars. I really make dua for that woman, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would guide her to Islam. You could see she has a soft heart. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide her to Islam, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give her hidayah. Anyhow, but let's say she still didn't die as a Muslim. Let's say she died as a disbeliever. Would we still deny that donating to the people in Africa, is it all evil, or is it good? We would definitely see, oh, you can't see the Quran, really? Can you? So can you see the Quran? Let's see what you could see. Now you could see it? Okay, so, okay.
Yes,
Okay, so sometimes I would basically change from this tafsir to the Quran. So you wouldn't always see the copy of the Quran.
yeah,
Sometimes you would see this page, the page of tafsir.
yeah,
Okay, so when we wouldn't deny that to donate for the people in Africa is at all. We wouldn't deny that it's not a good deed. It's definitely a good deed. There's no doubt that it's a good deed. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ أَن يُشْرَكَ بِهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned it and made it clear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not forgive associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning what? Meaning the worst sin that anybody can commit is basically shirk, is basically denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, for the good that she had donated, for example, in Africa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give her because He is most just. Okay. He will give her things to basically compensate, in other words, reward her for the good that she had invested in this dunya, not in the hereafter. In the hereafter, the reward is going to be based off faith. In this dunya, the reward can be based off faith and can also be based off in action and intention. So let's say a person that is a disbeliever, they basically donate, and let's say, they would always bring us the Mother Teresa example that she was a person that was giving and that lived her life in basically submission to God, at least to Christ, and that she was basically given to the orphans, even though some accusations later discovered that she was also selling orphans. Who knows if that is true? Regardless, I'm not here. Let's just make it as really the statement that we would all told that she was just basically helping the orphans and etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will compensate her in this dunya for whatever investment that she had invested in for this dunya, in this dunya. So let's say, whether a believer or a disbeliever, by the way, even if it's a disbeliever, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will still reward them in this dunya. Okay, so they donated, they helped the poor, whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to give them probably a compensation in their health, or maybe a compensation in their wealth, or maybe a compensation maybe in getting, who knows, fame or popularity or whatever it is in this dunya. But of course, this dunya is limited. So they will probably get some money and fame and cars in this dunya. But in the akhirah, the reward is only going to be وَالْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ وَلَلْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ وَأَبْقَى, because in this dunya, it basically is not a baqa. It is not forever. It's limited. But the hereafter is khair, is better, is everlasting. But this dunya is not everlasting. The person did get compensated for it in this dunya. How? When? Why? Etc. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had decreed that the akhirah would be for those that had believed, for those that had done what is right. And it's not enough to only do what is right, but it's also important to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's to take the time to basically submit to the message, submit to the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and simply embrace the ni'am and embrace the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. So now the foundation of wrong action is going to be افترى على الله كذبا. That's even worse. To deny is one thing, but to claim things on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is even worse. So that's why it said ممن افترى على الله كذبا أو كذب بآياته. When you look at the word أو, the word would mean or. Now, here's the thing. Scholars had differences of opinions. Does the word أو, does that mean this is worse? That is basically creating a blasphemy, creating things and attributing it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or are they basically on the same level? So if I'm saying this أو would mean that افترى على الله كذبا or كذب بآياته, then I'm saying that افترى على الله كذبا, to create lies on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is worse than denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if I'm saying that أو basically means just a general addition, so in other words, whether the person had created lies on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, made up things about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether denied Allah completely, or whether claimed that he had a son and that they were worshiping a son, or whether they had claimed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically not going to resurrect people, or claimed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically giving them the inspiration to perhaps worship idols and so forth, then all of that is going to be part of al-iftira ala Allah al-kadhib. And all of that is going to be making up lies on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore whether the person had denied or whether the person had made up lies about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it basically would fall as the worst sin anyone can commit. إنه لا يفلح الظالمون. For those that basically had done either or, then لا يفلح. What is لا يفلح? لا يفلح meaning that they would never get to success, that they would basically never find in any form or shape, the real happiness, the real stability, or whether in this dunya or whether in the hereafter. Because if you say إِنَّهُ لَا يُفْلِحُ الظَّالِمُونَ, what does this really mean? إِنَّهُ meaning verily, لَا يُفْلِح, that there's no way that they're going to be successful. But here's the question. Aren't we saying that some people, they are atheists, for example, but they're successful in probably making a good business. They're billionaires, though they're atheists, but they're billionaires, and they have a successful life. Hey, you could see, different people. They're atheists, but they've got the money and etc. So إنه لا يفلح is basically telling us that when we're speaking about al-falah, when we're speaking about success, we're not considering that the numbers of money is a reflection of success. When we speak about success, we're actually talking about something that is more comprehensive than money and numbers. We're speaking about life of success on the inside, basically their heart, life of success in their social relations, life of success basically in their life, and that they lived it based on the purpose that it was created for. Because if you're living your life off a different and for a different purpose than what life was created for, then you're definitely off track, then you're definitely not successful, because you used it for the wrong mean. You had the opportunity, but you used it for the wrong thing, then for sure this mean is going to turn off on you, because that's not what it was made for. Your life was not made for اللعب, for entertainment, for الlahu, for getting more of the dopamine or getting more of the ecstasy or whatever it is. It wasn't made for that. Then in that situation, even if you were to probably choose maybe to donate most of your money and you did not want to use that money for entertainment because, hey, that's not what you believe in. Well, I mean, you see, Richard Dawkins or, or not Richard Dawkins, but Stephen, what was his name? I forgot his name, but basically didn't use it much because he basically was disabled. What was his name? Stephen
Hawkins.
Stephen Hawkins. There you go. My son just named him. Okay. So then in that situation, well, what did they get it in? Well, when we speak about لا يفلح, we're talking about, are you using the privileges, the opportunity that you were given? Are you using it for the purpose that it was created for? That's the main thing. If you're not having your foundation in place, in other words, you don't have the information in regards to the purpose and also what preceded the purpose, that is Allah Almighty, then in that situation, you're definitely going to lose the compass in knowing how to put your life and its meaning in place. So when you see إِنَّهُ لَا يُفْلِحُ الظَّالِمُونَ, there's no way that they're going to reach to success, no way that they're going to reach to the purpose that they would be in search for, because they basically had the wrong compass. They basically had the wrong map. They basically had the wrong direction. So if they had the wrong compass, they had the wrong map, they had the wrong direction, everything was just basically going in the wrong place, then there's no way they're going to get to their destination. So when you look at إِنَّهُ لَا يُفْلِحُ الظَّالِمُونَ, there's no way they're going to get to their destination, because the paths are too many, but there's only one path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَيَوْمَ نَحْشُرُهُمْ جَمِيعًا. The ayah then takes us from laying out a statement of fact about recognizing purpose and recognizing the one that created life as the one to determine the purpose and therefore determine what it means to be on success and what the terms of success really mean and all of that. Well, since it's the Lord Almighty that created what is before life, then he would be the one to determine what is after life. Then he would be the one to determine the terms that connect the two dots of life and afterlife. He would be the one that we would use as our guide and our place of guidance to basically direct us towards the two dots, before life, after life, life itself, and basically that would need a specific compass that comes with the information that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent through the wahi. So then the ayah takes us into seeing, after it took us to connecting what is before life, then it takes us to look at afterlife. وَيَوْمَ نَحْشُرُهُمْ جَمِيعًا. On that day, there's that day when they would all be resurrected. What is al-hashr? Al-hashr is basically a different stages on Judgment Day. But what is al-hashr in itself? Al-hashr starts with first being resurrected, in other words, being brought back to life. So what happened before that? It didn't say when death comes to them. It basically skipped all those stages and took you to the final stage and said, well, I want you to think for yourself. when we were talking about the purpose. Now let's skip in stages, and I want you to stand on that day, and during that moment when you are resurrected, and all of you will be resurrected, all of you will be brought back to life. And then ثم نقول للذين أشركوا. Then, why ثم? ثم actually means that there's a time lapse. In other words, this is an indication that there are different stages and there are certain times, there are certain time lapses. And in other words, the chronology is not necessarily all clear to us, at least in this ayah, to tell us what comes first, then what happens second, etc. It's not necessarily clear, at least in this ayah. But it would take us, well, then you're all going to be resurrected. But then, ثُمَّ نَقُولُ لِلَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا. And then we would say, so when would this be told to them? Is it on the day of resurrection, at that moment when they're basically going out of their graves, or when they're being recreated again? Or is it later? It would be later. That's why this thumma came in. It's not like فَنَقُولُ. If it was the fa, then that would mean right instantly, this is what they're told. They're resurrected, and right instantly, this is what they're told, and all of that. But no. You could see that the time of al-hashr, is basically that moment when people are recreated, and they're created in a way where they are like brought back to life, like they're plants, really. Like plants? Like, what do you mean like plants? So when we say like plants, we're talking about people being recreated, and the seed that they would be recreated from is basically the backbone. That tailbone right there would be the seed, which basically would never decompose. And this tailbone, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send waters that would basically rain over the whole universe, basically, or earth, or wherever we're basically buried in. And then we would grow as plants would grow, basically. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would order Israfil to blow the horn in order to bring back our souls to us. That's when we would recognize that after waking up, and certainly the ayah was telling us that, well, not only are you going to be recreated, but even your fingerprints would also be recreated in the same way. The Prophet ﷺ said, يُحْشَرُ النَّاسُ حُفَاةً عُرَاةً غُرْلًا, that people would be resurrected on Judgment Day, حُفَاة, barefooted, عُرَى, naked, and غُرْلًا, غُرْلًا, not circumcised. In other words, all the different deformities, or all the different changes that one had done to their body, all the piercing and all the tattooing and everything that they had done to their body, would basically be not there, and they would be created in the same way that they were created when they were first created, of course, in their mother's womb. So what happens? Why create people back and all that? In order to basically, here we go, نَحْشُرُهُمْ جَمِيعًا, to hold them accountable. This is the day of accountability. Now, that first stage, when people are basically woken up from their deep sleep death, that's that minute that really all you could see is mere silence. At that moment, everyone is in mere silence and in complete fear. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ said that this is one of those stages, whether we're speaking about the stage of al-hashr or another stage is sirat. Some stages, everybody, including prophets, they would all live in fear, but the fear would vary from one person to another. Okay, but the ones that would be on the highest level of fear, قالوا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون, are basically the ones that had denied, and they would say, من بعثنا, who's the one that resurrected us from our long sleep? هذا ما وعد الرحمن. This is what الرحمن, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised, and this is what al-Mursalun and the prophets and the messengers had long foretold us about. That's when they recognize that this is real, that this is not something that they are imagining, but this is real. And now they recognize that they're going to face their fate. ثُمَّ نَقُولُ الَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا, then we would tell the ones that associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where are the things that you had associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the ones that you had claimed? That's when, of course, you would see that they recognize that that was nothing but a disgrace that they had committed. That wasn't something that they would say, well, okay, let me bring it up, because they recognize that this isn't something at all to be proud of. This isn't something that is at all going to be working. This isn't something that would at all give them safety. And this isn't something that would at all give them the security from any of what they would see. وَيَوْمَ نَحْشُرُهُمْ جَمِيعًا is basically right there telling us that there's no one that is going to be opted out. No one's going to opt out. No one is going to say, well, I choose not to come back. Okay, I'm done. No, there's no I'm done. You were given life and you were given the opportunities. There's no I'm done. There is right now a day of accountability. So when we look at الظالمون, when we look at ثم نقول الذين أشركوا أين شركاؤكم, where are your gods, where are the things that you had worshipped? What would they basically be asked here? This isn't at all an interrogative clause, but this is سؤال إفضاح لا إفصاح. What does that mean? This is not a question of interrogation, but this is a question of humiliation. Why? This isn't seeking an answer. This isn't asking you, where are the things? Can you show me those things? This isn't asking you to give me the answer to the question that I'm asking you. This is to expose that you, in this life, you had claimed and you had worshipped other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, keep in mind that the word worship in Islam is basically more comprehensive. Let's look at the word worship for a second. The word worship usually is referring to some form of ritual, some form of belief that one might have, and that would basically be considered the ritual, that would be considered what they had believed in, what they had invested in, let's say, a spiritual relationship. But the word worship in Islam is more comprehensive. It's not just to invest spiritually, but it's what you had also invested mentally, physically. Your time is also one of those dimensions. What did you do with your time? What did you do with your potentials? What did you do with your body? What did you do with the money that you had? What did you do with your youthhood when your age, at its peak in terms of in terms of what gains and what development and all the different things that you could have used that basically for the good. Then we look at worship is a lot more comprehensive than making it as a spiritual, or at least as something that is within your spirit, because your spirit is not the only thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you as a potential. So therefore, whether we're speaking about physical, or whether we're speaking about social, or whether we're speaking about financial, every single potential that you were given is basically going to be considered as a potential. And what did you use it for? And did you, and here's the point, did you submit it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If the person submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that is worship. What areas are we speaking about in terms of putting it in submission? We're speaking about physical. We're speaking about spiritual. We're speaking about mental. We're speaking about intention as well. Intention to meaning what? To meaning heart. All those areas are supposed to be coming together in order to submit to the Lord Almighty. And in Islam, the word worship is a lot more comprehensive than making it as something confined in a ritual practice, because Islam considers that even if you were to pick up a piece of garbage off the floor, that's worship. If you are to say good words, that's worship. And therefore, if you are to say bad words, that's a sin. If you
Isn't that the difference between Islam and every other ism or religion or anything?
Absolutely, because Islam considers that everything in your life is supposed to be channeled towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That every potential that you were given is basically supposed to be in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it's your words, or whether it's your behavior, your physical potentials, let's say use it that way, or whether it's your mind, or whether it's what you're looking at. Every single corner is going to be in peace of worship, to mean it's either going to be in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or if it does not submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it's practicing a sin. Okay, so when we look at the ayah, ثُمَّ نَقُولُ الَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا أَيْنَ شُرَكَاؤُكُمْ? Remember, this isn't an interrogative clause, but this is a humiliating clause right there, and telling them, well, where are they? Now you recognize that they're not there. Did you not recognize that those were fake gods that you had submitted to, that you did not recognize, that the prophets were trying to bring it to you, that this is not true? The prophets were bringing it to you to let you know and recognize that there's no way that these things can be God, and therefore there's no way that you should be submitting to these gods, and therefore now recognize on Judgment Day. And this is very important in making a statement. Sometimes it's important to say, okay, I want you to look 10 years from now. Where are you at? I want you to look farther than that. When you're resurrected on Judgment Day, what is going to happen? And this is important to also teach your children to think ahead. When you teach your children, I want you to think 10 years from now. Are you going to be using your time to basically be something that you would harvest 10 years from now, 20 years from now, or perhaps on Judgment Day? What are you using your time for? Are you using your potentials? Are you using your intelligence? Are you using your life? Are you using your wealth? How are you using that? Those are the potentials. Are you investing it for the hereafter? And that's that focus for a Muslim. For a mu'min, they would look beyond getting a job, beyond probably guaranteeing a good CV and probably getting a good living, etc. No, Islam tells you, I want you to look past that, because this life is short. I want you to look past this life, and I want you to look in the hereafter. I want you to think the hereafter, always to be present on your mind. Am I using my potentials? Am I using my time? Am I using my wealth? Am I using my age? Am I using, and the list goes on and on. Am I using it for the sake of the hereafter? Am I using it for that day when I'm going to be held accountable and being asked, did you use it wisely? Did you use it as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told you and directed you to basically use it in? So therefore, when you look at this ayah, ثُمَّ لَقُولُ الَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا, this isn't necessarily just talking about, certainly the context of this ayah is talking about the disbelievers, whether we're speaking about the disbelievers, those that associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or whether this is talking about somebody denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at large. If somebody is denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that would be the same thing. In other words, their compass was basically considering that there is no God and therefore nothing that they would turn to in this life. And they would create their own reason, they would create their own false method, false direction, and then in the end, it would basically fall within this pattern. It would fall within this pattern. What is it? That they had basically considered the centricity of existence is other than Allah Almighty. So whether it's to consider the centricity is some kind of a deity, or whether it's to consider the centricity that it's just nothing but matter in motion that this life is existing and existing based on. That's also a form of kufr, and definitely a form of considering that the centricity is evolving something else. Okay, so let's see. And why was it even asking the question, where are the things that you had basically considered as your God? Why that? Why not just focus on probably something else like your people? There is another ayah when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically in other surahs, just like in Surah was it Abad? No, Surah Al-Nazi'at. What would they do? What they would bring me the ayah in Surah Al-Nazi'at at the end. فإذا جاءت الطامة الكبرى يوم يفر المرء من أخيه وأمه وأبيه وصاحبته وبنيه وفصيلته التي تؤويه. Okay, that's another Surah Al-Ma'arij. I confused the two surahs. Okay, I confused the two surahs. Okay, so in the end is that the person they would use whatever it takes in order to run away from the consequence that they had basically put in. So why bring it in this ayah as well? أَيْنَ شُرَكَاؤُكُمْ? Were the things that you had basically believed in. Why? Because when you say something that they had believed in, it was something that they had thought that was what was going to bring them security. So this ayah is then saying, well, where is whatever you had claimed was what was bringing you security? What was bringing you basically the safety? What was giving you the provisions? You had claimed that it's something else. So since you had claimed that it was something else, then now you cannot ask for the reward from someone else. Because you had lived your life, that is telling the mushrik, you had lived your life in service to whatever you had believed in. Then therefore you cannot expect the reward to be from something that you had not served, or from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you had not served. So that's why shirk is the worst thing. That person lived in service for something else, then you cannot come in on Judgment Day and ask for the reward for the services that you had given to whatever thing that you had worshipped. And certainly, هذا توبيخ لهم. What is توبيخ? توبيخ basically means that this is a statement of scolding. This is exposing their statements. This is exposing their lies. This is exposing basically the contradictions and the discrepancies that they would be living in. You recognize that these things that you're worshiping are not providing you things. You recognize that these things that you are worshiping are not capable of giving life to their own selves. You recognize that these things that you are worshiping, they don't give you stability, they don't give you life, they don't give you provision, they don't give you security, they don't give you anything. Then in that situation, well, then why are you giving them your service? Whether it's your puja, the Hindus giving them the puja to the gods, or serving them, or whether it's giving them life, or whether it's even if it's a flower, or whatever,
their own desires.
or their own desires, or even if it's somebody that doesn't believe in God. You gave all this life, you believed in this life, and you had given this life, and you had considered that it's nothing but matter in motion. You wanted this life to be just matter in motion. You wanted to live it like it's matter in motion. Then in that situation, you cannot expect that this life, since you worshipped life, that you cannot expect that this life would basically be coming as to giving you the service that you had expected. And of course, certainly, when we're speaking about ثُمَّ لَمْ تَكُنْ فِتْنَتُهُمْ إِلَّا أَنْ قَالُوا, then of course, the biggest fitna, what is the biggest fitna? When we say the biggest fitna, we're speaking about that time, that moment when they would come to realization. And that's that fitna. It's the test. It's the answer that they would recognize that it was really just to expose their discrepancies, expose their confusion, expose the blasphemy that they had created. What was it? That this question right there, wait, how did that happen? Okay, so they thought that this ثم نقول الذين أشركوا أين شركاؤكم were the things that you had worshipped. So we said before that it's إفصاح إفضاح لا إفصاح. We said that this was not an interrogative clause, but it was more of a humiliating statement. Okay. So that was that moment that they thought, well, that's a question. That's why the ayah said, ثُمَّ لَمْ تَكُنْ فِتْنَتُهُمْ إِلَّا أَنْ قَالُوا وَاللَّهِ رَبِّنَا مَا كُنَّا مُشْرِكِينَ. That took them to another type of exposure. Then that fitna, they thought, maybe we could answer that question. Did they really want to answer the question? So they recognized when the question asked, when they were asked, well, where is what you were associating partners with? Where are those things that you had claimed they were going to be at your service? Where are they? So that's when they would come in and say, by Allah, we weren't associating partners with you. In other words, we weren't believing in these things. So what did they want to do? They knew that that was a lie. So that's when the ayah says, انظر كيف كذبوا على أنفسهم. Now just watch and just see how they had basically even denied and even lied about their own selves. They didn't just lie about those things being God, but now even about their commitment, they're denying that they were at all being committed to anything, being committed to those gods. In other words, now they're recognizing that, that this question right there wasn't really a question, but they still wanted to answer it, even though they recognized it was a humiliation, but they then wanted to somehow run away from this humiliation by saying, no, we were not associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We weren't believing in these things. And basically, they wanted to basically find any way where they could probably get summoned and probably get protected and probably get dismissed from the consequence that is later to come. Let's continue. وَضَلَّ عَنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا يَفْتَرُونَ. ضَلَّ عَنْهُمْ. What is ضَلَّ عَنْهُمْ? ضَلَّ means to go away and get in delusion. That's a dalal. A dalal is when you get into a delusion. What is a delusion? A delusion is when a person basically goes off the track. An illusion is when you think that you're seeing something in a certain way, and you're going into some kind of an optical, I guess, illusion right there. You think you're seeing something, but then you discover that it's not there, or something like that. Your brain is basically playing games on you. A delusion, you are certain that you're going the right way, but then you're completely wrong. Your brain is playing games on you. You are in a delusion, but here, ضَلَّ عَنْهُ. Or who's actually in a delusion right now? Are they in delusion, or is whatever they had worshipped is right now away from them? So one, ضَلَّ, can mean to be lost, and can mean to be in a delusion, and can also mean to be distant from. Okay? So when you look at ضَلَّ عَنْهُمْ, in other words, it was separated from, it was distant from, it was basically all. They did not have that connection. So the result, when they basically had denied that they had given service to any, whether it's life or whether it's whatever gods that they had worshipped, etc. Now after they had said, well, we weren't associating partners, we weren't believing in these things, we weren't even servicing them, etc. Then that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ضَلَّ عَنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا يَفْتَرُونَ. That's when there was that separation between them and whatever they had claimed basically to being God. ضَلَّ عَنْهُمْ. It was something that was one, it wasn't going to be in their service anymore. And certainly they too do not want to service this anymore, because they recognize that this is a mere delusion and that it was not the right thing. It was not the right path. And مَا كَانُوا يَفْتَرُونَ, all the different things that they had done in iftira. What is an iftira? An iftira is basically to create a blasphemy, a slander, iftira, a blasphemy, or make up a lie. And in that situation, we would know that on Judgment Day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَوْمَئِذٍ يَوَدُّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا وَعَصَوُا الرَّسُولَ لَوْ تُسَوَّى بِهِمُ الْأَرْضُ وَلَا يَكْتُمُونَ اللَّهَ حَدِيثًا. On Judgment Day, the disbelievers and those that had disobeyed the Prophet, they would wish that the earth would flatten upon them and flatten on them, and they would not be silent in any testimony, whether it's what they would testify about themselves, or basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would expose them about, and etc. And in the end, we would basically see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had exposed what they had done in terms of one, shirk, and two, in terms of living their life and how they will be creating all those different claims and all those different paths, but in the end, it would basically come at them and exposing them, and it would not be in service. Okay, وَمِنْهُمْ مَن يَسْتَمِعُ إِلَيْكَ. And some of them, they would be listening to you. So if they're listening, وَمِنْهُمْ مَن يَسْتَمِعُ إِلَيْكَ. Some of them, they would be listening to you. وَجَعَلْنَا عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ أَكِنَّةً أَن يَفْقَهُوا. Yet, we had put on their hearts akinna. What is al-akinna? Al-akinna is basically anything that would be an obstruction. What does that mean? So, what this ayah is telling us that, yes, they would be hearing. There's a difference between al-istima' and al-sama'. To hear something, you're maybe walking down the road, you know that there's music being played in the background, but you're not really focused on that. That's a sama'. Al-istima', I'm hearing the music and I'm singing along and I'm understanding what it's saying, and that's basically al-istima'. Okay, so وَمِنْهُمْ مَن يَسْتَمِعُ إِلَيْكَ. Some of them, they would really hear. You would ask them and you would probably say, well, you know what, I'm going to ask you and make sure that you understood what I had said. Oh, they'll be answer the questions and they'll definitely be hearing you, and they'll definitely have tentative listening. It was tentative listening. They were definitely understanding what was being said. But وَجَعَلْنَا عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ أَكِنَّةً is actually telling us that in terms of understanding, there are different levels of comprehension. There's a difference between knowing the information and between processing the information and how your body basically absorbs that information and what it does and how we absorb that information from one person to another basically differs. Even though the information in terms of data, yes, it is processed in the same way. The data itself is processed in the same way. That's why it said, وَمِنْهُمْ مَن يَسْتَمِعُ إِلَيْكَ. They would process it, they would hear it, but according to this ayah, وَجَعَلْنَا عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ أَكِنَّةً أَن يَفْقَهُوا. That there's a difference between processing some information in the brain, and according to this ayah, that there's another place of processing the information, and that is in the heart. That the heart basically has certain areas to process certain information, and that is what gets that fiqh, that deep understanding that recognizes the words, recognizes the implementation, recognizes the commitment, recognizes that relationship. So recognizes basically the depth of all that information. So that's جَعَلْنَا عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ أَكِنَّةً, basically to tell us that when we look at data, it's not just processing in the ear. The ear is the first stage of understanding. You're hearing it, that's okay. The information is basically stored in the brain, but that's not the place, according to this ayah, that's not the place of comprehension. According to this ayah, the place of comprehension is the heart. Then it continues, وَفِي آذَانِهِمْ وَقْرًا. Now that's quite interesting, because it says وَفِي آذَانِهِمْ وَقْرًا, that in their ears there's al-waqr. What is al-waqr? Al-waqr can mean earwax, but this isn't talking about earwax, that there's some earwax, because we all have earwax. It's basically there to keep the ear clean, etc. This isn't talking about anything in relationship to anatomy, but this is talking about the processing of information. What really happened? Why did these disbelievers basically deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What got them to here? They recognized the discrepancy. They recognized all of that. What really happened? What happened to these people to lead them into the consequence that they're in? So that's why this ayah is breaking it down for us. They would hear you, but then the hearts would not process. في آذانهم وقرا, and even in their ears are not processing. Wait a minute. Is that also giving me the inference that there is some cell receptors, whatever you want to call them, in the ears that are also responsible for storing data and comprehension? Possibly. وَإِن يَرَوْا كُلَّ آيَةٍ لَا يُؤْمِنُوا بِهَا. And no matter what miracle they had seen, لَا يُؤْمِنُوا بِهَا. Wait a minute. Do you see an ayah? Is this speaking about a verse in the Quran? Or is this speaking about a miracle? Because this is saying yaraw, but the focus was about hearing. Look at it right here, the focus was about hearing something, their ears are basically seeing something, or hearing something, and here their ears are basically obstructed with something that they're not capable of hearing, or at least processing the information. But then it goes into telling us about seeing. How did we go from hearing to seeing? وَإِن يَرَوْا كُلَّ آيَةٍ لَا يُؤْمِنُوا بِهَا. And even if they were to see every single verse, wait a minute, aren't the verses something that we could hear and not see? So how is it that it's saying وَإِن يَرَوْا كُلَّ آيَةٍ لَا يُؤْمِنُوا بِهَا? I would hear the ayat and not necessarily see the ayat, unless I'm visual, okay, but I could see them. But just by seeing them, it doesn't mean I process them. So this ayah, وَإِن يَرَوْا, so whether it's they're hearing the words, or even if we were to take the words or the miracles to another level where they could actually see it with their own bare eyes, in other words, see something materialistic before their eyes, they would still deny. In other words, the problem is not in did they hear it enough? Did I say it to a certain number of times? Did I explain my words clearly? Is there something wrong with me? Did I not deliver the message? So this ayah is basically exposing a number of different areas. Even if they were to see certain ayat, even if they were to see the miracles, they would still be in denial. Why? Ibn al-Hajib, who's actually a very important scholar, believe it or not, Ibn al-Hajib only lived 45 years old. That's pretty much my age. Only lived 45 years old, but he had left behind great ilm. Ibn al-Hajib was one of those with Ibn Kathir, with al-Dhahabi, with Ibn al-Qayyim. They were basically the direct students that they were gathering around Ibn Taymiyyah. Okay. Ibn al-Hajib was a Hanbali madhab. He basically said the word hatta is an indication that the reason for all this happening to them, in other words, what we're trying to get out of all of this is what led to such consequence of basically disbelief. That's what we're trying to get to. What happened? What led to all of this? So Ibn al-Hajib, he said, or that was actually Ibn Rajab. I confused Ibn Rajab with Ibn Hajib. Okay. حتى إذا جاءوك يجادلونك يقول الذين كفروا إن هذا إلا أساطير الأولين. When they would come to you, what would they do? They were just debating. They weren't even, and here's the thing, when a person debates, they're not always listening to the other person. They just want to put their statements forward, and they're not listening to the rebuttals. They weren't even listening to the rebuttals. They just wanted their own statements to silence the other person. And this is something that we often do when we're speaking, when we're holding a dialogue. In the middle of the conversation, we would say, and what are we doing? We're just trying to create white noise. So in order not to give the other person the chance to find silence to speak. So we would start, even if we're saying nothing, we're just going to make some noises to obstruct the space to give you in order to say anything. Now, that's what the disbelievers were doing. يُجَادِلُونَكَ, they would just go into these arguments and not necessarily listen and hear the words and hear even the rebuttals, but they were there to silence you and not to listen to what you're saying. يقول الذين كفروا, the disbelievers would then say, إن هذا إلا أساطير الأولين. These are just old legends. But the word asatir is actually, believe it or not, is actually not an Arabic word. The word asatir is actually a word that is a Roman word. Well, they would call it Roman, but it was Latin. Okay. What does it mean? It means history. Asatir or ustura. Ustura, all right, is the singular of it. Ustura, history. Okay. It's history. Al-awwalin, the past. So why would the Arabic language, why would the Arabic word actually use asatir as history, as the legends of the past? Where did they get it from? They didn't recognize that some of what the Prophet ﷺ had come with basically has similar stories that are similar to what was said in the stories that were brought, at least from the people of the book, and perhaps even from the past that were basically mentioned of prophets, Judgment Day, some of the things, but they wanted to say that they're just legends. In other words, they didn't even want to hear the details, and they considered that what they have is basically factual and that this is nothing but legend. They didn't say that, well, if throughout history this was always something that was mentioned, then there was a certain basis throughout history that there was some information that was transmitted throughout history from one generation to another in order to get to you. In other words, there was a voice throughout history telling you about this, that I am telling you, that you were not created for no purpose, and basically for nothing but absurdity or nihilism, and that you were created for a purpose. And that was the voice that throughout history you were hearing it. It was being transmitted. It was transmitted from one generation to another to tell you, but throughout the generations they wanted to deny it as nothing but fake. So when you look at this one, what would their behavior really do? وَهُمْ يَنْهَوْنَ عَنْهُ وَيَنْأَوْنَ عَنْهُ. Then the behavior, they would basically just reject it. Why? Because they didn't even process the information. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't even give the time to process it with their own hearts. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us that فَإِنَّهَا لَا تَعْمَى الْأَبْصَارِ وَلَكِنْ تَعْمَى الْقُلُوبُ الَّتِي فِي الصُّدُورِ. It's basically not the eyes that cannot say it, but it's the hearts that would not be capable of seeing. Notice that the ayah said فَإِنَّهَا لَا تَعْمَى الْأَبْصَارِ وَلَكِنْ تَعْمَى الْقُلُوبُ الَّتِي فِي الصُّدُورِ. So what does that tell us? Here it tells us that al-qalb basically understands. Al-qalb can go blind. Al-qalb can even have some obstruction. Well, we know the piece of obstruction when we would call it a stroke. Okay, we know that piece of it, but that's not the obstruction that we're talking about. In other words, we're talking about certain receptors that we are probably not capable of seeing, at least now, but maybe down in the future, we might probably come to some studies that would tell us that, hey, we discovered that the heart basically is helping in processing data. How does it process data? What kind of data do we process? Is there a certain area that is responsible for processing data about life and processing data about other things? That's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that وَلَتَعْلَمُنَّ نَبَأَهُ بَعْدَ حِينٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Fussilat that one day every single piece of information that was sent down onto you into the Quran, you will know the truth of it. So in other words, what we're seeing in science, that's actually going to be in service to bring more and more miracles and for people to recognize that the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were really words of mere facts and divine coming from the Lord Almighty, and it was not metaphorical, it was not a legend, and certainly it was not in any shape or form any words made up by the Prophet ﷺ, but it was coming from the divine Almighty. So when you look at, well, what happened to them? How do we not let our hearts get into that obstruction? That's, I guess, what matters to us. How do we not let the hearts get into such obstruction? Number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ مَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ. كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ. What is Iran? Iran, in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ explains that the person would be exposed to different fitan. What are fitan? Different trials, different things that they might enjoy. But then the heart would be kind of like a haymat. This haymat would basically have those areas, there are loopholes, there are different areas where some air, some water could basically sneak and basically go through these areas and find their way basically within the mat. That the heart is exactly like that. That you could be exposed to the wrong friends. You could be exposed to probably, hey, the wrong thing that you had probably seen on your laptop, or probably wrong friends that said the wrong words or anything like that. Your heart can either absorb that or can completely reject it. If your heart completely rejects it, it then creates a spot of light. If your heart absorbs it, then it creates a black spot. That black spot becomes this obstruction that is basically disabling your receptors, at least within your heart, from processing the data. And that's why the ayah said, كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ مَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ. In other words, your behavior, الْكَسْب, whatever you would behave in, whatever you're listening to, whatever you're seeing, the environment that you put yourself in, whatever you're saying, all of these different things, they become the things that would affect your heart and basically its ability to enhance the receptors or disable the receptors. So these receptors are basically the receptors of understanding, are the receptors of basically giving you, let's call it the awareness, the enlightenment. the enlightenment to recognize, to hear, to process the ideas, to process the information that was sent on to the prophets. And this is very important. How is that information that was sent on to the prophets different than the information that we basically learn about science? Is it different or is it the same? Well, they overlap. Yes, some of that information is the same, but there's another type of information that basically has the power to help guide you. In other words, has the power to give you the grit on faith, the perseverance on faith, the power. And you want to keep in mind, every single success, it doesn't come with you knowing it, but it comes with you training in it and creating that consistency in doing it. For example, if you're talking about school, it's not just you knowing the information and doing it, but it's going into the training, going into that commitment, doing it again and again and again and again until you create that stamina, until you create the perseverance, until you create the identity of who you are. Well, that's not only in that, that's in each and every single thing, even if we're talking about sports. You might know that, okay, I know how to shoot baskets, but it isn't until you continue to practice that you would be so good at it that your brain would not even need to process the angles and measurement and all of that. You just do it and it just goes as without you even focusing on it. It becomes who you are. Well, that's not only sports and school and all of that, but it's basically everything in life. Every success comes with repetition, repeating the behavior on and on and on and on. And that's why we know how to pray. Khalas, we're done. I know how to do it. But no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, you have to do it on and on and on and on and be committed to it. Get into the full process of how it moves from a word of mouth to a word that processes in your brain to then letting your heart fully comprehend it and fully, oh, just give me a second. ومنهم, sorry about that, just got a phone call from the hospital. Okay, وجعلنا على قلوبهم أكنة أن يفقهوا وفي آذانهم وقرا. Just keeping those receptors in place to keep the receptor basically live, to keep it strong, to keep it basically live, to helping you process the data of what you would hear from the ayat, what you would hear from the directions, the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's basically coming in. What are you doing? How are you processing that information? Are you just wasting time to just argue about the different meanings? Or are you taking the time to say, okay, I recognize this meaning, I recognize the principles, now I have to figure out a way to stay committed to the meanings, stay committed to the principles. I want you to look at this one. You know, it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting. I really hope that we would go further. وهم ينهون عنه وينأون عنه ويهلكون إلا أنفسهم وما يشعرون. What is ويهلكون? يهلكون means that they would basically just waste their energy. And they don't even recognize that, they don't even feel it, they don't even sense it. They're going to probably school, yes, getting into prestigious universities. They're putting a lot of investment in studying and a lot of hours in studying and probably going back and forth and probably even, creating circles of activity and trying to get that CV up and going into their internship and all that stuff and etc. But then they may not recognize that if they're going off the path, that it's just wasted energy. It's just wasted time, wasted energy if it does not lead them to guidance. وَمَا يَشْعُرُونَ. They wouldn't even recognize it. They wouldn't even see it. How could they see it? How could they recognize it? Well, they could only recognize it only if they were to channel their mind to process the ideas, to their behavior, to make sure that it's helping them see the truth, and they're channeling their behavior to help them see what is beyond their entertainment, what is beyond feeding their own body and feeding their entertainment. وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ وُقِفُوا عَلَى النَّارِ. If only you would say, they would be standing. What is وُقِفُوا? Are they وَقَفُوا or وُقِفُوا? So it's not that, well, there is another qira'ah, waqafu, but wuqifu ala nar, it's not something that it's a passive voice, basically. It's not that something that they are doing by choice. They are being held despite their will and against their will right at the doorsteps of hellfire. Nasallahu al-afwa wal-afiyah. And then they would say, Ya laytana nuraddu wa la nukadhiba bi ayati rabbina. What is Ya laytana? Ya laytana, it's a word, it's basically a word of ism fi'l. In other words, it's basically a word to show what their hopes are. What does that mean? Ya laytana, if only. It's a wishful word. We wish that we would be returned and we would not deny the words of the Lord Almighty and we would be amongst the believers. What happened? Why did they do that? Why did they get into that? Let's see in Sahih Muslim. يلقى العبد. In Sahih Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ said, يلقى العبد فيقول let's see, أي فلان, oh, speaking to the person, ألم أكرمك, ألم أسودك, وأزوجك, وأسخر لك الخيل والإبل. What does that mean? So in Sahih Muslim, the servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be spoken to and he would be told, did I not give you all the bounties? Did I not give you social status? Did I not give you marriage? Did I not subjugate the different animals, whether horses or camels, to you, and basically get you into such and such position? And they would say, yes. أَفَظَنَنْتَ أَنَّكَ مُلَاقِي. Did you not think that you were going to meet this one day? And he would say, no. So what happened? He said, فَإِنِّي أَنْسَاكَ كَمَا نَسِيتَنِي. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, I will now disregard you as you had disregarded Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I want you to look at this one. Because nasiya, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, إِنَّا نَسِينَاهُمْ كَمَا نَسُوا, what? They had forgotten? Is this speaking, that does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forget? No. This isn't to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he says, إِنَّا نَسِينَاهُمْ, it doesn't mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgotten them. It means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had disregarded them. So then, since they disregarded Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they were disregarded. And then he would tell the other one the same thing, and he would find a third and the fourth. But then, of course, Ya Rabbi, آمنت بك وبكتابك وبرسولك وصليت وصمت وتصدقت ويثني بخير ما استطاع. Then the third one would come, oh Lord Almighty, I had believed in you. I had believed in your books. I had believed in your prophets. I had prayed. I had fasted. I had donated, and I would give. And I had done such and such good. And they would start counting. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically, of course, this person is coming in to say all of that. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he would say, well, let's bring a witness. And then he would think of, well, who's going to be witnessing on me? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically block their mouths, and then his thigh, his flesh, his bones would then be ordered to speak, and they would speak, and then this person would be basically coming in with his own flesh and body, saying and confessing that they were actually in disbelief and not in belief, but that they do their homework.
That's why it's so important that we have ikhlas, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, you would
May
usually
Allah
think,
subhanahu wa
"I'm doing
ta'ala
my
give us
homework.
all ikhlas.
I believed, I prayed, I basically did all my homework," but then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, no, I don't want you a word of mouth, and then block the mouth and let the other thing speak. Ya Rabbi nas'al Allah al-afwa wal-afiyah. Ya Rabbi nas'al Allah
Ameen,
al-afwa.
ameen.
Allah al-afwa wal-afiyah. انظر كيف كذبوا على أنفسهم. Just see how they would just deny about themselves, and eventually they basically had thought that what they were doing was right, and then ضل عنهم ما كانوا يفترون. All that they had claimed, right now they could see it right before their eyes, disseminating, just going in different areas, and then basically not coming at their service whatsoever. And certainly, when you look at the word undur, I want you to look at this one right here, when it was basically telling us, undur kayfa kadhabu. Is it something that he's really asking us to just watch closely, or what are we looking at here? Are we talking about just looking, really literally looking? But no, this is actually another yuradu bihi al-i'tibar. This isn't literally telling you to go and see and watch movies and all of that. No, this is actually telling us that there are different levels of seeing. There's the level of seeing that you're basically capable of recognizing this is a cup, this is a plate, etc. And there's another level of seeing, which is having deep insight. Okay, insight is different than sight. Insight is when you are seeing things through your heart. And that's why when he said, "Undur kayfa kadhabu ala anfusihim," then it says, وَمِنْهُمْ مَن يَسْتَمِعُ إِلَيْكَ. What does it say? Well, some of them would be hearing it. But just as the sight can go wrong, the insight can go also wrong. The inside of what processes that information, which is the heart. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. So
That's why we
how
have the
do we-
Quran, subhanallah.
Absolutely. How do we make sure that such contaminants, whether it's on the eyes or whether it's on the heart or whether it's on the ears, how do we make sure that we're removing such contaminants from affecting and obstructing our receptors or our iman receptors? That's what tazkiyah is all about. Tazkiyah is all about removing all the different contaminants that are obstructing your ability to have insight, your ability to process ideas, your ability to hear the words and process the words. In other words, all those different things. Now, according to Al-Quran, of course, I'm just here making the story short, okay? According to the Quran, كلا بل ران على قلوبهم, when we're speaking about the different behaviors, so different words that you might say, different behaviors that you might engage in, different things that you might listen to, all of those things, they would act as things that would obstruct that, let's call it enlightenment and enlightened processing. So if you are to say bad words, for example, what would that eventually do? It would obstruct your ability to process things in your heart, process or even see the truth, or even hear the words of good, or even process the ideas. That's why you would say شكوت إلى وكيع سوء حفظي فأرشدني إلى ترك المعاصي وأخبرني بأن العلم نور ونور الله لا يهدى لعاصي. What was that? He said, I complained to my teacher Wakia, and he told him that I wasn't able to memorize. Why wasn't he able to memorize? He said, أرشدني إلى ترك المعاصي. He had instructed me to abstain from sin. Why? Because he told me that ilm is light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and light would not be given to somebody that is a sinner. And that's that key. That light is different from just plain data. There is data that somebody can be an atheist and process certain data wonderfully. But the light that comes from that data is a different thing. The light that comes, which is that insight, that's processed with that qalb, that open heart, to basically help us see the truth as truth and falsehood as falsehood, and basically connect us with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so I'm going to stop right here, inshallah, for this one, for the tafsir. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. No questions? All right.